Imagine saving the world and then having to erase yourself from it. Everyone you love is still out there. They're doing fine. Better than fine, actually. They just don't know you exist. That's where this movie starts. 4 years after No Way Home, Peter Parker is an adult living completely alone in a New York that has no idea who he is. He's a full-time Spider-Man now, because being Spider-Man is the only relationship he has left. And here's what makes this one worth talking about. Spider-Man, Brand New Day, just broke the biggest opening weekend record in movie history. It has the highest audience score of any solo Spider-Man film ever made. It's the highest rated MCU movie in the history of Letterboxd. And it's also the lowest rated Tom Holland Spider-Man movie on Rotten Tomatoes. Those things are all true at the same time. Which means somewhere in this movie there's a genuine disagreement happening. Not the usual fans versus critics shouting match, but something more specific than that. So let's find it. Start with the guy in the director's chair, because he explains a lot. Destin Daniel Cretton made Shang-Chi, and if you remember one thing about that movie, it's probably the fight choreography. Real bodies, real geography. Camera holding on the action instead of cutting around it. That instinct is all over this film, and it's the single most praised element in the reviews. The other name that matters is Michael Giacchino on score. He's now written music for all 4 of Holland's Spider-Man films. And multiple critics called the score the thing holding the tone together. The balance between the big superhero swing and the quieter. Sadder stuff underneath. Cinematographer Brett Pollack is worth a mention too. And I don't usually say that about MCU movies. But a recurring line in the reviews is that this is one of the best looking Marvel films in years. Largely because it isn't afraid of daylight. If you felt like every MCU movie has started to look like the same grey soup, that complaint apparently doesn't apply here. Runtime is 2 hours and 25 minutes. Hold on to that number, because it comes back. Here's the premise, spoiler-free. Peter is fighting crime in a city that doesn't remember him, watching MJ and Ned move on with lives that no longer have him in them. The pressure of carrying that alone starts to change him in ways he can't fully control. And a new threat surfaces in the city, one he can't figure out how to fight. That's it. That's the setup. And I think this is where the movie makes its smartest decision. Because notice what's missing. There's no multiverse. No cameos from other timelines. No universe collapsing stakes. David Rooney at The Hollywood Reporter put it about as plainly as a critic can. He praises the film for having the good sense to stop banging on about the multiverse. Liz Shannon Miller at Consequence makes the same point from the other direction. This isn't a movie about saving the galaxy. It's a movie about what actually keeps Spider-Man going. And it's better for that. And once you accept that framing, the critical praise starts to organize itself into 3 very clear groups. The first group is about scale. A lot of critics essentially said the same thing, that this is the most grounded, most street-level, most purely Spider-Man movie in a long time. Alexander Zalben at Comic Book Club calls it the most purely Spider-Man film since Raimi's Spider-Man. 2. David Gonzalez at the Cinematic Reel says it's the closest the MCU's Spidey has come to the heart of the Raimi films, and adds that he can't think of higher praise. Mike Ryan at The Hard Pass lands in the same place. When that many people independently reach for the same comparison, that's not coincidence. That's a movie hitting a specific target on purpose. The second group is about the action. And this is where Cretton's fingerprints show. Owen Gleiberman at Variety says he stages the Spidey action with a clever, leaping grandeur that delivers exactly what these movies need. David Gonzalez points out that Cretton leans into practical filmmaking wherever he can, and that the set pieces demand real precision from everyone involved. Hoai Tran Bui at Inverse says the fights rival his Shang-Chi work with an extra layer of Spider-Man physicality on top. Nagier Chambers at Big Gold Belt calls the action among the best the MCU has delivered in years. The third group is Holland himself, and honestly, this is the most consistent praise in the entire critical response. Rooney's assessment is 2 words: never better. David Ehrlich at IndieWire, who is not fully on board with this movie, and we'll get to that, still calls it Holland's most nuanced and mature performance in the role. Boy says he finally gets real dramatic material and sells Peter's loneliness. And Alyssa Wilkinson at the New York Times makes the point that nothing undercuts the pleasure of watching Holland here, even knowing how much of the Spidey on screen has to be computer generated. There's a fourth thing that keeps coming up, and it surprised me. John Bernthal's Punisher. Liz Shannon Miller says he might be the cast highlight, and that watching Frank and Peter yell at each other is pure pleasure. William Bibbiani at The Wrap calls him a perfect foil for Holland, and describes the pairing as comedy gold. So the buddy dynamic isn't just a marketing hook. It's landing Amy Nicholson at the LA Times summed the whole thing up in a phrase I keep coming back to. She says Cretton has quietly made a humanist super flick. That's the movie people are responding to. So if all of that is true, why is this the lowest rated Holland Spider-Man movie with critics? Because the complaints are also remarkably unanimous, and they all point at the same thing. Gleiberman at Variety calls it arduous, overly episodic, and half an hour too long. David Gonzalez says the screenplay feels overstuffed, and the 2.5-hour runtime is unnecessary. Patrick Beattie at See It or Skip It puts it best. It feels bloated, and somehow still leaves you wanting more from some characters and less from others, because it's crammed with as much as it can possibly balance. And here's the sharper version of the same criticism. David Ehrlich argues that the film keeps sidelining its own core relationship, Peter, MJ, and Ned, to spend time on a villain backstory that stops the movie dead. Caitlin Booth at Bleeding Cool makes a similar case. The world building ends up marginalizing the hero. Nagier Chambers frames it as the film starting grounded and emotional and gradually getting pulled into the larger MCU web. And William Bibbiani drops the line that every superhero fan will recognize, that on the drive home, you realize the villain's plan doesn't actually make sense. So look at what's actually being said here. Nobody is arguing the movie is bad. The critics who like it most and the critics who like it least agree on the exact same diagnosis. There is an excellent, focused, small Spider-Man movie in here, and there is a second movie sitting on top of it doing franchise homework. On Metacritic, that averages out to a 70, which, for what it's worth, is right in line with Homecoming's 73, Far From Home's 69, and No Way Home's 71. Critically, this era of Spider-Man has been astonishingly consistent. Now here's the part that makes this film genuinely unusual. Audiences did not split the difference. They went the other way entirely. The Rotten Tomatoes audience score sits at 98% off more than 10,000 reviews, the highest popcorn meter score of any solo Spider-Man movie ever made. Live action or animated, above No Way Home's 97. On IMDb, it's an 8.2, the highest of any live-action Spider-Man film in history. And on Letterboxd, it's sitting at 4.2, which makes it the highest-rated MCU movie on that platform. Full stop. Average everything on a 100-point scale, and the film lands around 84.8, with only about a 7-point gap between critics and audiences. Which sounds small until you remember that gap runs in the opposite direction from what we usually see. So what are audiences responding to that critics are discounting? I think the Letterboxd reviews answer it better than any professional write-up. One of the most liked reviews on the entire film is 3 words long. Sincerity is back on the menu. That's it. That's the whole thing. Critic Zoe Rose Bryant writes a version of this that I find really clarifying. She says she's trying to reconcile what feels like 2 different stories being told, and that everything involving Peter is exactly what she wanted after No Way Home. Street level, back to basics, yearning taken to the extreme. A guy struggling to balance both of his identities. She calls Holland's work here his best in the role. Says the Peter and MJ scenes are the highlight of the film, and then adds the thing that connects the critics and the audience. She just hopes that next time, he gets a story that belongs solely to him. That's the same criticism Ehrlich made. She just weighs it differently, because the parts that work moved her. And that's my read on the gap. Critics are grading a screenplay. Audiences are grading an experience. If the emotional core of this film reaches you, the extra half hour of franchise scaffolding is a tax you're willing to pay. If it doesn't, that half hour is all you can see. Not everyone in the audience is sold, to be fair. One Letterboxd user argued it does nothing genuinely. New with the plot, and would have been standard Marvel product if it weren't for Spider-Man himself. While still admitting the New York sequences and the soundtrack are a vibe, which is, in its own way, the exact same review the professionals wrote. And then there's the box office, which stopped being a story about this movie and became a story about the industry. $360 million domestic in the opening weekend. That's the biggest opening in the history of North American theatrical release. It beat Avengers Endgame. $932 million worldwide in 3 days, the second biggest global opening ever. It crossed $1 billion in 6 days, second only to Endgame. Fastest film ever to $400 million domestic in 4 days. Biggest Monday in box office history at $47 million. Biggest Tuesday ever at $42 million. A second weekend of $144 million. The third biggest second weekend on record. As of right now, it's sitting around $1.75 billion worldwide, and it isn't finished. Here's why I think that matters beyond the trivia. The entire conversation for the last few years has been superhero fatigue. That audiences were done. That the genre had burned its goodwill. And the thing that broke every record wasn't a team-up. Wasn't a multiverse event. Wasn't 12 cameos. It was one guy in one city with a personal problem. That's not a small lesson, and I hope somebody at Marvel is writing it down. Because the critics' single biggest complaint about this film is the exact instinct the box office just proved unnecessary. So, where does that leave us? Brand New Day is not a flawless film. It is too long. It does interrupt its best material to service a larger plan. The villain doesn't hold up if you think about it on the drive home. Those criticisms are real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it does the thing the MCU has struggled to do for years. It makes you care about one person. It gives Holland the best material he's ever had in this role. It stages action with actual craft instead of digital noise. And it remembers that Spider-Man works best when the stakes are a few city blocks wide. My score is 8.5 out of 10. Trim 20 minutes of franchise homework. And this is a 9, comfortably. As it stands, I'd call it the best. Film in the Holland run, and the strongest MCU. Release in years. But here's what I actually want to argue. Yeah, about in the comments. Every single critic who criticized this movie criticized the same thing. The setup for what comes next. And audiences gave it the biggest opening in history anyway. So which one is Marvel going to listen to? And, more importantly, which one should they? Tell me where you land. And if you think this really is the best Spider-Man film since Spider-Man 2, say it with your chest, because a lot of people are saying it, and I want to know if you agree. I'll see you in the next one.